Police officer arrests black woman, but 7 minutes later, he's unemployed. In today's video, we explore a shocking incident that unfolded when a police officer arrested a black woman under questionable circumstances. What seemed like a routine encounter quickly escalated, leading to unforeseen consequences. The entire situation unraveled in just a span of 7 minutes, leaving the community and onlookers in disbelief. If you're excited about this story, please let us know. If you enjoyed the video, please press 1. If not, press 0. Your feedback has inspired me to collect more uplifting and meaningful stories.
It was a warm afternoon in the busy city of Atlanta. FBI Special Agent Tara Johnson, a brilliant and highly respected black woman, was driving back to her office after completing an intense investigation. She had been working on a high-profile case for months, tracking down a dangerous drug cartel, and she was close to making a breakthrough. Despite the exhaustion from long hours and pressure, Tara felt a sense of pride in her work. It wasn't easy being one of the few black women in a predominantly white, male-dominated agency, but she had earned her place. As she drove through the city, her mind raced with the details of the case. She was replaying the latest intel in her head when, suddenly, flashing blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Surprised, she glanced down at the speedometer. She wasn't speeding. Confused, she pulled over to the side of the road, wondering what she could have possibly done wrong. A police car pulled up behind her, and out stepped a tall, white officer with a stern expression. He slowly walked up to her window, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. Tara rolled down her window, keeping calm as she reached for her FBI badge, ready to explain who she was. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" Tara asked politely. The officer, whose name badge read Officer Daniels, barely looked at her. "License and registration," he barked, not bothering to greet her. Tara was taken aback by his tone but remained professional. "I'm an FBI agent." "Here's my badge," she said, holding it out for him to see. Officer Daniels barely glanced at it before frowning. "I said, license and registration." Tara's heart skipped a beat. Something wasn't right. She had encountered difficult cops before, but Daniels was different. His cold, dismissive attitude toward her authority as a federal agent sent a chill down her spine. "Officer, I'm a federal agent." "I'm on official duty," she reiterated, maintaining her calm demeanor. She was trying to defuse the situation before it escalated. Daniels narrowed his eyes, ignoring her completely. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered sharply. Tara stared at him, shocked by the sudden escalation. "Excuse me. Are you deaf?" "I said step out of the vehicle." Daniel's voice rose, drawing the attention of people nearby. Tara hesitated. She knew her rights, and she knew this wasn't right. There was no valid reason for her to be pulled over, let alone be asked to exit her car. But the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. She had been trained to handle high-stress situations, but this felt different. The tension in the air was thick, and the racial undertones were impossible to ignore. "Officer, I'm complying with your request, but I need you to understand that I am an FBI agent," she repeated, trying to de-escalate the situation. Daniel's face twisted with disdain as he leaned closer to her window. "I don't care if you're the president. Step out of the vehicle, or I'll drag you out myself." Tara felt a knot in her stomach. She slowly opened her car door and stepped out, keeping her hands visible at all times. The people passing by were starting to watch, whispering among themselves, but no one intervened. Daniels moved toward her, and before she could say another word, he grabbed her roughly by the arm and shoved her against the car. "Hey! What are you doing?" Tara protested, her voice laced with anger and disbelief. "Resisting arrest, huh?" Daniels sneered as he twisted her arm behind her back. "You think you can just flash a badge and do whatever you want, don't you?" Tara winced as the handcuffs tightened around her wrists. She couldn't believe what was happening. This was beyond humiliating. It was an outright abuse of power. As a federal agent, she had the authority to handle cases far more serious than simple traffic stops. Yet here she was, being treated like a common criminal, simply because Officer Daniels refused to recognize her status. People were now openly staring, some even recording the scene with their phones. Tara's face burned with a mix of anger and embarrassment, but she kept her head held high. She knew that she had done nothing wrong, and she wasn't going to let this racist officer break her spirit. "Officer Daniels, you're making a mistake," Tara said firmly, though her voice trembled slightly from the anger boiling inside her. "Shut your mouth," Daniels snapped. "You think you're better than everyone else just because you work for the FBI? Well, let me tell you something. You're not above the law." Tara's mind raced. She needed to stay calm, but she also needed to figure out how to get out of this situation without making it worse. Her colleagues at the FBI would never believe this if she told them, arrested for no reason while on duty. Daniels dragged her toward his patrol car, ignoring her every attempt to reason with him. As he shoved her into the back seat, she caught a glimpse of the people filming. The bystanders looked shocked, some murmuring in disbelief. But no one stepped forward to help. No one challenged the officer's actions. As the door slammed shut, Tara took a deep breath. She had been through many tough situations in her career, but this felt different. This felt personal. Daniels had crossed a line, and she knew she couldn't let him get away with it. Her mind started working fast. She had to figure out her next move. Would she call for backup? Would she file a formal complaint? She couldn't afford to lose her temper, not now, but she also couldn't let this injustice go unanswered. As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, Tara's thoughts raced. This was far from over. Tara sat in the back of the patrol car, her wrists throbbing from the tight handcuffs, the cold metal biting into her skin. She looked out the window, watching as the city streets blurred past. Her mind was racing. This wasn't just an ordinary arrest, this was something much deeper. Officer Daniels clearly had a personal vendetta, and it was aimed squarely at her. But why? Was it because she was a black woman? Or because he thought he could assert his authority over her without consequence? Either way, it didn't matter now. What mattered was how she would handle this. As they drove, Tara tried to keep her composure. She had been trained to stay calm under pressure, and this situation required every ounce of self-control she had. Her first instinct was to grab her phone and call her supervisor, but she couldn't reach it with her hands cuffed behind her back. She considered asking Daniels to loosen the cuffs, but from the look on his face earlier, she doubted he'd even consider it. Daniels glanced at her through the rearview mirror, a smirk playing on his lips. "You really thought you could get away with pretending to be FBI, didn't you?" he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. Tara's eyes narrowed. "I'm not pretending. I am a federal agent, and you're making a huge mistake." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Sure you are. And I'm the chief of police." His mocking tone made Tara's blood boil, but she bit her tongue, refusing to engage with him further. It was clear that reasoning with him wasn't going to work. The car came to a stop in front of a small police station on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't the usual precinct she was familiar with. It seemed like an older, less used station. Tara's stomach sank as she realized this wasn't just about a simple misunderstanding. Daniels had taken her somewhere away from the main precinct, likely to avoid any attention from higher-ups or her colleagues at the FBI. He got out of the car and opened the back door, grabbing her arm roughly as he pulled her out. "Let's go, agent," he sneered, emphasizing the word agent as if it was a joke. Tara winced as he shoved her toward the entrance of the station. She knew she had to remain calm, but the humiliation and anger were building inside her. She had been through a lot in her career, endless training, dangerous field operations, but nothing had prepared her for this kind of blatant disrespect. It wasn't just about the arrest, it was about being seen as less than because of her skin color, her gender, and her position. Inside the station, it was eerily quiet. The few officers who were there barely glanced up as Daniels led her past the front desk. Tara noticed their lack of reaction, as if this kind of behavior from Daniels was normal, expected even. It was a chilling realization. No one was going to step in on her behalf. She was on her own. Daniels pushed her into a small interrogation room and slammed the door shut behind them. The room was dimly lit, with only a small metal table and 2 chairs. He shoved her into one of the chairs, still keeping the handcuffs on. "Let's get one thing straight," he began, pacing back and forth in front of her. "I don't care who you say you are. As far as I'm concerned, you're just another criminal trying to pull a fast one." Tara glared at him, refusing to be intimidated. "You're violating my rights. You have no reason to hold me, and when this is over, you'll regret it." Daniel stopped pacing and leaned in close to her, his face inches from hers. "Is that a threat, Agent?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. Tara didn't flinch. "It's a promise." He stared at her for a moment, then laughed bitterly. "You really think you're untouchable, don't you? Flashing that badge like it means something. Well, let me tell you something, you're in my territory now." Tara could feel the tension in the air, but she remained steady, meeting his gaze without fear. "I've dealt with bigger threats than you, Officer Daniels. You won't get away with this." Daniels straightened up, his smirk returning. "We'll see about that," he muttered before walking out of the room, leaving her alone. As the door closed behind him, Tara exhaled slowly. She needed to find a way to contact her team. She couldn't rely on anyone in this station to help her, and she was sure that Daniels would do everything in his power to keep her isolated. Her mind raced through her options. There had to be a way to get out of this mess and turn the situation in her favor. She scanned the room, looking for anything that could help. There was a small window near the ceiling, but it was too high to reach, and the door was locked from the outside. The only thing she had was her badge, which she still carried in her jacket pocket. But in her current state, with her hands cuffed, she couldn't even reach it. Minutes passed, and Tara's frustration grew. She wasn't used to being in this kind of position. She was always the one in control, the one making the arrests, not the other way around. The power dynamics in this room were entirely different, and she had to figure out a way to regain the upper hand. Suddenly, the door swung open, and another officer entered the room. This one was younger, maybe in his early 30s, with a nervous expression on his face. He seemed different from Daniels, less sure of himself, less aggressive. He glanced at her, then at the file in his hand, before speaking. "Agent Johnson," he began cautiously, "I'm Officer Mitchell. I was told to process you for holding, but I just want to say, I'm sorry about all this." Tara looked at him, surprised. His voice lacked the hostility she had come to expect from Daniels. Maybe, just maybe, he could be an ally. Before she could respond, Daniels appeared in the doorway, his expression darkening as he glared at Mitchell. "What are you waiting for? Get her processed," he snapped, his eyes burning with contempt. Mitchell hesitated, his discomfort obvious, but he nodded reluctantly. "Yes, sir." Daniels lingered for a moment longer, his gaze shifting between Tara and Mitchell, before turning and leaving the room again. Tara's eyes met Mitchell's. She had a feeling he might be the key to her getting out of this situation. Tara watched Officer Mitchell with a mix of hope and caution. He seemed uneasy, maybe even sympathetic, but she couldn't be sure. She knew from experience that people in his position often wavered when push came to shove, especially under the pressure of someone like Daniels. Still, she couldn't afford to let any possible opportunity slip through her fingers. Mitchell cleared his throat awkwardly as he pulled a small notebook from his pocket. "I'm going to need some information," he said, his voice a bit shaky. "It's just routine, name, date of birth, that kind of thing." Tara studied him closely. His reluctance was clear in the way his eyes kept darting to the door, as if he expected Daniels to burst in at any moment. "You already know who I am," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "What you're doing here isn't right, and you know it." Mitchell's hand froze mid-scribble, and for a brief second, their eyes met. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, guilt, perhaps, but it was quickly masked by a forced sense of duty. He looked back down at his notepad, avoiding her gaze. "I don't make the rules," he muttered under his breath. Tara leaned forward slightly, her voice low and steady. "You might not make the rules, but you can decide whether or not to follow orders that you know are wrong." Mitchell hesitated again, the pen trembling in his hand. The tension in the small interrogation room was thick, and it was clear that he was struggling internally. Tara could see the conflict playing out on his face. She had been in enough high-pressure situations to recognize when someone was grappling with their conscience. "I can help you, Mitchell," she continued, her tone softening. "But you have to help me first." Mitchell looked around nervously, then back at her. He sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't how things are supposed to go," he said, almost to himself. "I know something's off, but Daniels, he's the senior officer. I can't just understand." "Daniels is abusing his power," Tara interrupted, her voice sharp but controlled. "You've seen it. You know it. And if you don't do something about it now, you're just as responsible." Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The weight of her words hung in the air, and he looked visibly torn. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could respond, the door to the interrogation room flew open. Daniel stormed in, his expression hard and angry. "What's taking so long?" he barked, glaring at Mitchell. "She's a simple perp, not a puzzle to solve." Mitchell shot up from his chair, stammering slightly. I was just getting the basic information, sir." Daniel sneered at him, clearly unimpressed. "Get her into holding already. We don't have all day." Mitchell nodded quickly, stuffing his notepad back into his pocket. He avoided Tara's gaze as he stood up, motioning for her to follow him. But Tara wasn't done. She knew this might be her only chance to get through to him, and she wasn't about to let fear silence her. "You're making a mistake, Officer Daniels," Tara said, her voice steady and authoritative. "This is going to come back on you. I guarantee it." Daniels laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed off the walls. "Oh, I'm sure you think so, sweetheart. But in this town, nobody cares about your so-called authority. You think just because you have a fancy FBI badge that makes you untouchable? Think again." Tara held his gaze, refusing to back down. "I'm not here to impress you, Daniels. I'm here to do my job. And trust me, the people who do care will be coming for you." For a moment, something flickered in Daniel's eyes, a brief flash of uncertainty. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual smug arrogance. He waved his hand dismissively at Mitchell. "Get her out of my sight," he snapped. Mitchell, clearly rattled, stepped forward and grabbed Tara by the arm, leading her out of the room and down a narrow hallway. As they walked, the tension between them was palpable. Tara could sense that Mitchell was still struggling with what had just happened, but he remained silent. They reached a small holding cell at the end of the hallway. Mitchell unlocked the door and motioned for her to step inside. Tara paused for a moment, looking at him directly. "You still have a choice," she said quietly, her eyes locked on his. "You don't have to go along with this." Mitchell looked down, his shoulders slumping. He muttered something under his breath, but it was too soft for Tara to hear. Without another word, he shut the cell door behind her and walked away. Tara sat on the small, cold bench inside the cell, taking a deep breath. The walls felt like they were closing in on her, but she forced herself to remain calm. She knew she had to stay level-headed if she was going to get out of this situation. panic wouldn't help her now. Hours seemed to drag by as she sat there, alone with her thoughts. Every passing minute only fueled her frustration and anger. She wasn't just fighting for her freedom, she was fighting against the injustice that had led her here in the first place. The blatant racism, the abuse of power, the humiliation, all of it burned in her chest like a fire she couldn't put out. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hallway. Tara tensed, wondering who it could be this time. To her surprise, it wasn't Daniels who appeared at the door of her cell, but Mitchell. He looked around nervously, checking to see if anyone else was nearby, before quickly unlocking the door. Tara's heart raced as he motioned for her to follow him. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her eyes wide with confusion. Mitchell glanced over his shoulder, his face pale with anxiety. "I'm getting you out of here. But we don't have much time." Tara hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether to trust him. But she knew she didn't have any other options. If there was even a small chance that he was genuine, she had to take it. Without another word, she followed him out of the cell and down the hallway. They moved quickly through the dimly lit station, avoiding the main areas where other officers might be. Tara's heart pounded in her chest as they reached a back exit. Mitchell paused, pulling out a set of keys and unlocking the door. "This is your chance," he said quietly, looking at her with a mix of fear and resolve. "Get out of here before Daniels catches on." Tara's mind was spinning. Could she really trust him? Or was this some kind of trap? She didn't have time to think it through. Tara stood frozen by the back exit, the cold night air creeping in through the small gap as Mitchell held the door open. Her mind raced. Could she really trust him? This entire ordeal had been a nightmare, and after everything she'd been through, it was hard to believe that anyone in that precinct would actually help her. Mitchell glanced nervously at his watch. "We don't have much time," he urged in a hushed voice. His anxiety was palpable, and his eyes kept darting around like he expected Daniels to appear at any second. Tara took a deep breath. She knew she couldn't stay there, especially not after what Daniels had done, but running could only complicate things. She was an FBI agent, after all, and disappearing from a police station would raise too many questions. She was caught between a rock and a hard place. The system, the very one she had trusted and worked for, had betrayed her. And now, she had to make a quick decision. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Mitchell hesitated. He opened his mouth to answer but quickly closed it, looking conflicted. His eyes flickered with guilt and desperation. "Because it's wrong," he finally muttered. "What Daniels is doing, it's not just wrong. It's illegal. He's going to pay for it one way or another, but right now, if you stay, you're going to be the one who suffers. You have to get out of here before it's too late." Tara stared at him, trying to gauge the sincerity in his words. There was something about the way he spoke, the way he looked at her, like he was pleading with her to believe him. But could she? Was he genuinely trying to help, or was he just looking for a way to save his own skin? She couldn't shake the feeling that something still didn't add up. But the clock was ticking, and she didn't have time to dwell on it. If Mitchell was telling the truth, staying there would only make her situation worse. If Daniels came back and saw her still locked up, there was no telling what he would do next. Tara knew better than to underestimate a man like him, a man fueled by hate and authority. Taking a leap of faith, she nodded and stepped toward the door. "All right," she whispered. "Let's go." Mitchell's face softened in relief, and he quickly ushered her outside. The cool night air hit her face, sharp and refreshing, and for the first time in hours, she felt a glimmer of hope. They moved quietly, sticking close to the shadows as they made their way through the back alley behind the precinct. Tara's senses were on high alert. Every rustle of the wind, every distant sound of footsteps, sent her heart racing. She was trained for situations like this, But it was different when the threat came from the very people meant to uphold the law. It was unnerving, knowing that at any moment, Daniels could catch up to them. Mitchell led her to a small, beat-up car parked near the alley's end. He fumbled with his keys for a second before unlocking the passenger door. "Get in," he whispered, glancing around nervously. Tara slid into the seat, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. Mitchell jumped in on the driver's side and started the engine, the low rumble of the car echoing in the quiet night. As they pulled away from the precinct, the tension in the car was thick. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Tara couldn't shake the unease building in her gut. They were out, but they weren't safe, not yet. Daniels wouldn't let this slide. He was the kind of man who thrived on control, and losing it would only make him more dangerous. Finally, Tara broke the silence. "Where are we going?" Mitchell kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "I'm taking you somewhere safe," he said. "Someplace Daniels won't find you." Tara raised an eyebrow, her skepticism returning. "And what then?" "I can't just run. You know that. I need to deal with this." Mitchell glanced at her, his face tense. "I know. But you need time. Time to figure out your next move, time to gather evidence against him. If you stay here, Daniels will bury you before you even get the chance." Tara leaned back in her seat, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. She hated the idea of running, but Mitchell had a point. She needed more information, something concrete that would expose Daniels and his corruption. But where would she even begin? And how could she trust anyone in that precinct after what had happened? The car sped down the empty streets, the city lights flickering past them in a blur. Tara stared out the window, her mind working overtime. She needed to contact her team at the FBI, but Daniels had confiscated her phone back at the precinct. Her hands curled into fists in frustration. It was one thing after another. "Mitchell," she said suddenly, her voice sharp. "We need to stop. I need a phone." Mitchell hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously to the rearview mirror. "We can't stop yet. It's too risky." Tara clenched her jaw. "I can't do this without communicating with my people. I need backup. If we're going to take Daniels down, I can't be working in the dark." Mitchell sighed, clearly torn. After a moment of silence, he relented. "There's a gas station a few miles up. We'll stop there. You can make your call, but we have to be quick. If Daniels is onto us, we don't have much time." Tara nodded in agreement, her mind already thinking ahead to who she would contact first. She knew exactly who to reach out to, a colleague who owed her a favor, someone she could trust to act fast and discreetly. As they approached the gas station, Mitchell pulled into the dimly lit lot and parked near the side. Tara glanced around, her instincts kicking in. She was always cautious, but now more than ever, she couldn't afford any mistakes. Every second mattered. She stepped out of the car, her eyes scanning the empty lot as she made her way toward the payphone. Mitchell stayed in the car, keeping an eye on the surroundings. Tara picked up the phone and quickly dialed the number she had memorized, praying that her colleague would answer. The phone rang once, twice, then finally, a voice answered on the other end. "Tara? Is that you?" Tara's grip tightened on the phone as her colleague's voice came through the line. Relief washed over her, but she knew time was not on her side. Every second that passed increased the risk of Daniels tracking them down. "Yeah, it's me," she whispered urgently. "I'm in trouble, and I need your help. Daniels is dirty. He arrested me for no reason, and now he's trying to cover his tracks." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Tara could hear her colleague, Agent Jackson, taking a deep breath. "All right, calm down. Where are you right now?" "I'm outside a gas station, on the outskirts of town. I escaped with the help of one of the officers, Mitchell." But I don't know how long we have before Daniels realizes I'm gone. He's dangerous, Jackson. We need to move fast. Jackson's voice grew serious. Okay, listen. We'll send backup, but you need to stay low until we get to you. Do you trust this Mitchell guy? Tara glanced over at Mitchell, who was anxiously tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, his eyes darting around the dark parking lot. I'm not sure, she admitted. But he got me out of that precinct, and right now, he's all I've got. Jackson sighed. All right. I'm going to pull some strings and get a team to your location, but you need to keep your head down. Daniels won't go down without a fight, and if he realizes you're working against him, things could get ugly. Tara nodded, though Jackson couldn't see her. I understand. I'll keep moving until you send backup. Don't let me down, Jackson. You know I won't. Stay safe, Tara. The line went dead, and Tara hung up the phone, her mind racing. She felt a surge of determination. She wasn't out of the woods yet, but at least she had a plan. Backup was on the way, and with Jackson's help, they could finally bring Daniels down. Tara hurried back to the car and slid into the passenger seat. Mitchell glanced at her, his brow furrowed with concern. Everything okay? He asked. For now, Tara replied. I made the call. My team's sending backup, but we can't stay here. Daniels will be looking for us, and it won't take long for him to figure out I'm gone. Mitchell nodded and shifted the car into gear, pulling out of the gas station and back onto the road. The night seemed darker now, the streets eerily empty as they sped through the city. Tara kept her eyes on the side mirrors, scanning for any signs of pursuit, but so far, it looked like they were in the clear. As the minutes ticked by, the tension between them grew heavier. Tara couldn't help but replay the events of the night in her mind. Every moment since she'd first encountered Daniels had been a blur of anger, confusion, and humiliation. The way he had looked at her, the sneer on his face as he handcuffed her, still made her blood boil. How could someone like him be in a position of power? She glanced at Mitchell, who had been quiet since they left the gas station. He looked tired, his face drawn and pale in the dim light of the dashboard. It was clear that helping her had cost him something, whether it was his loyalty to Daniels or his sense of safety, she wasn't sure. But for whatever reason, he had chosen to side with her, and that gave her a sliver of hope. You didn't have to do this, Tara said softly, breaking the silence. Mitchell sighed, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. Yeah, I did. I couldn't just stand by and let him get away with it. Daniels has been corrupt for years, but no one's ever had the guts to stand up to him. He's got the whole precinct wrapped around his finger. I knew that if I didn't do something, you'd end up paying the price for his mess. Tara studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. Why now? She asked. Why did you decide to help me? Mitchell hesitated, his eyes flicking to the road ahead. Because I've seen what happens to people who cross him. I've seen what he does to anyone who threatens his control. And you weren't just another person he could push around. You're an FBI agent. If he took you down, it would send a message to everyone else, that no one's safe from him. I couldn't let that happen. Tara nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of his words. Daniels wasn't just trying to humiliate her, he was trying to make an example of her. He wanted to show everyone that even someone like her, someone with authority and power, could be broken under his rule. But Tara wasn't the type to be broken. She had spent her entire career fighting for justice, and she wasn't about to let a racist, power-hungry cop like Daniel strip her of that. She would see this through, no matter what it took. As they drove in silence, the city's outskirts gradually gave way to more rural surroundings. The streets grew narrower, the lights fewer and farther between. Mitchell had taken them far from the main roads, likely in an attempt to avoid being tracked. But Tara knew it wouldn't be long before Daniels figured out they were gone. He'd have the entire precinct looking for them soon enough. After what felt like an eternity, Mitchell pulled into a small, secluded parking lot near the edge of a dense forest. The area was deserted, save for a few scattered buildings in the distance. He cut the engine and turned to Tara, his expression grim. "We'll wait here until your team arrives," he said quietly. "It's out of the way, and Daniels won't think to look here. At least, not right away." Tara glanced around the empty lot, her instincts telling her to remain on high alert. Every shadow seemed to stretch and move, and the eerie silence only added to the feeling of unease. But for now, this was the best option they had. She nodded and leaned back in her seat, her mind still racing with thoughts of what was to come. They were safe for the moment, but the danger was far from over. Daniels wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted, and that meant they had to stay one step ahead of him. Mitchell shifted in his seat, glancing nervously at the dark woods surrounding them. "We should stay quiet," he muttered. "If anyone's following us, we don't want to draw attention." Tara agreed. They had come too far to risk being caught now. As they sat in the car, the minutes seemed to stretch into hours. Every sound outside, the rustling of leaves, the distant hum of traffic, felt amplified in the stillness of the night. Tara's mind wandered, thinking about what her next move would be once Jackson's team arrived. She couldn't just run and hide forever. She had to take action, to ensure that Daniels was held accountable for everything he had done. But that would require a solid plan, and more than just backup. She needed proof. Something concrete that would expose Daniels for the corrupt cop he was. The stillness of the night was broken only by the occasional creak of branches swaying in the wind. Tara's mind raced as she and Mitchell sat in the dark, secluded parking lot. The faint glow from the dashboard illuminated their tense faces, and each minute felt heavier than the last. Mitchell kept glancing around nervously. His eyes darted from the rearview mirror to the side windows, scanning for any sign of approaching headlights. Tara noticed his unease, though she couldn't blame him. They were both running from a man with unchecked power, a man who would stop at nothing to protect his secret. "I'm still trying to wrap my head around all of this," Mitchell muttered, breaking the silence. "Daniels has always been a snake, but I didn't think he'd take it this far." Tara turned to him, her voice calm but firm. "He's more than just a snake. Daniels thrives on intimidation, on controlling everyone around him. But his time's running out. I'm going to make sure of that." Mitchell gave a nod but still seemed doubtful. "I get that you want to take him down, but he's got the entire department wrapped around his finger. Most of them are too scared to speak up. They know what happens to anyone who crosses him." Tara sighed. She understood the fear that Daniels instilled in people. She had seen it firsthand when he threw his weight around like he owned the place. But this wasn't just about fear, it was about justice. Daniels had gone too far, and now he was targeting her to cover his tracks. She wouldn't let him get away with it. "What we need is solid evidence," Tara said, thinking aloud. "We need something undeniable that proves he's been abusing his power, something that can't be dismissed as hearsay." Mitchell frowned, looking unsure. "Easier said than done. Daniels isn't sloppy. He covers his tracks well, and no one in the precinct is going to help us. They're all afraid of what he'll do if they talk." Tara's mind raced. She knew Mitchell was right. Going after Daniels wouldn't be easy, especially when most of the officers in the department either supported him or were too scared to challenge him. But she also knew there had to be a way. Daniels had been corrupt for too long, and people like him always made mistakes eventually. It was just a matter of finding the right thread to pull. "There's got to be something," she said, more to herself than to Mitchell. "A paper trail, an eyewitness, anything." Mitchell stayed quiet, staring out the windshield. The tension in the car was palpable, and for a moment, they both lapsed into silence again, lost in their thoughts. Suddenly, Tara's phone buzzed. She fumbled for it, her heart racing as she saw the screen light up with a message from Jackson. The message was brief but gave her the news she was waiting for. Backup is 15 minutes away. Stay put. Relief washed over her, though it was short-lived. Daniels might be relentless, but so was she. Backup was coming, but she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to escalate. Backup's on the way, Tara said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. We just have to stay low until they get here. Mitchell nodded, though he still seemed on edge. I hope they get here before Daniels does. Tara didn't respond. She knew Mitchell was right to be worried. Daniels wouldn't sit back and let her escape without a fight. As far as he was concerned, she was a threat that needed to be eliminated, and he wouldn't rest until she was silenced for good. The quiet night outside was suddenly interrupted by the faint sound of an engine in the distance. Mitchell's eyes widened, and he quickly glanced at the side mirror. You hear that? He whispered. Tara tensed, listening carefully. The sound was growing louder, and her stomach churned with anxiety. Was it backup, or had Daniels found them already? Mitchell leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. I don't like this, he muttered. We're too exposed out here. Tara's pulse quickened as she strained to see through the gloom. The distant rumble of the engine grew louder, and her mind raced with worst-case scenarios. If Daniels had caught up to them, there was no telling what he would do. We need to move, Mitchell said urgently, turning the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and Tara's heart pounded in her chest. They couldn't afford to sit around and wait to find out who was coming. Mitchell slammed his foot on the gas, and the car lurched forward, tearing out of the parking lot and onto the narrow road. Tara glanced over her shoulder, scanning the darkness for any signs of pursuit. Her hands clenched into fists, and she silently prayed that backup would arrive soon. As they sped down the deserted road, Tara's mind raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to spiral out of control. Daniels was closing in, and it felt like they were running out of time. Mitchell swerved onto a side road, the car bumping along the uneven pavement. They were deep into the rural outskirts now, surrounded by thick woods and silence. Tara's eyes darted between the rearview mirror and the dark road ahead, searching for any sign of danger. Are you sure this is a good idea? She asked, her voice tight with anxiety. We're heading into the middle of nowhere. Mitchell shook his head, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. It's better than waiting around for Daniels to find us. At least out here, we have a chance. Tara wasn't convinced, but she knew they didn't have many options. They needed to buy time until Jackson's team arrived, and staying on the move was the only way to avoid being cornered by Daniels. As they drove deeper into the woods, the narrow road grew even more treacherous. The car bounced and jolted over potholes and cracks in the pavement, and Tara clung to the door, trying to steady herself. Suddenly, the sound of another car engine echoed through the night, and Tara's heart leaped into her throat. She turned to Mitchell, her eyes wide with alarm. He's found us, she whispered. Mitchell's face paled, and without a word, he pressed harder on the gas, the car speeding up as they raced down the dark road. Tara's pulse pounded in her ears as the headlights of a vehicle appeared in the distance, growing closer with every passing second. Hold on, Mitchell muttered, his voice tense with fear. He swerved the car onto an even smaller road, barely wide enough for one vehicle. The headlights behind them were closing in, and Tara knew they were running out of options. The car swerved violently as they sped down the narrow road, and Tara's heart raced as she clung to her seat, praying they could outrun whoever was chasing them. Mitchell's grip tightened on the wheel as the narrow road stretched before them, twisting and turning through the dense forest. The headlights from the vehicle behind them illuminated the trees, casting long, eerie shadows that flickered across their path. Tara's heart raced as the car bounced over uneven ground, the tires barely gripping the worn-out pavement. Whoever that is, they're not giving up, Mitchell muttered under his breath, his voice edged with panic. Tara glanced at the side mirror, her pulse quickening as the car behind them grew closer. The glaring headlights seemed to pierce the darkness, threatening to swallow them whole. She couldn't see who was behind the wheel, but she didn't need to. It could only be one person, Daniels. "He's relentless," Tara said through gritted teeth, her eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. "But we can't let him catch us." "Not now." Mitchell nodded, his face grim as he pushed the car even harder. The engine groaned in protest as they tore through the winding road, the tires squealing as they rounded each sharp curve. The trees loomed closer on either side, and the road seemed to narrow with every mile. "We're going to lose him," Mitchell said, though it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. Tara wasn't so sure. Daniels had already proven that he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. And what he wanted was her. She could feel the weight of his obsession pressing down on her like a heavy cloud. He wasn't just a corrupt officer, he was a man who thrived on power and control, and right now, she was the one thing standing in his way. The road ahead suddenly split into two paths, and Mitchell made a split-second decision, veering sharply to the left. The car lurched sideways, and Tara grabbed the dashboard to steady herself. The headlights behind them flickered for a moment before reappearing, now on the same path they had taken. "Damn it," Mitchell cursed under his breath. "He's still on us." Tara's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. They couldn't outrun Daniels forever, especially not on these back roads. They needed to think of something, and fast. "We can't just keep driving," Tara said, her voice tight with urgency. "He'll catch us eventually. We need to do something." Mitchell glanced at her, his jaw clenched. "What do you suggest?" "We're out in the middle of nowhere." Tara's eyes flickered to the forest on either side of the road. The trees were thick and dark, their branches twisting together like a web. It wasn't an ideal hiding spot, but it was the only option they had. "Pull over," she said suddenly. "We'll ditch the car and head into the woods." Mitchell shot her a skeptical look. "Into the woods? Are you serious?" Tara nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "It's our best shot. Daniels won't be able to follow us through the trees. We can lose him." Mitchell hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror as the car behind them inched closer. Then, with a deep breath, he nodded. "All right. Let's do it." He swerved the car to the side of the road, skidding to a stop just as the headlights of the pursuing vehicle loomed large behind them. Tara didn't waste a second. She flung open the passenger door and jumped out, her feet hitting the gravel with a crunch. Mitchell was right behind her, slamming his door shut as they sprinted toward the thick line of trees. The forest was dark and unwelcoming, but Tara didn't care. They needed to disappear, and fast. The sound of the other car screeching to a halt echoed through the night, and Tara's pulse quickened. They didn't have much time. "Come on," she whispered urgently, grabbing Mitchell's arm and pulling him into the shadows of the trees. The thick branches overhead blocked out what little light there was, plunging them into near-total darkness. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, the thick underbrush making it difficult to move quickly. But Tara didn't slow down. She could hear the sound of a car door slamming in the distance, followed by the crunch of boots on gravel. Daniels was coming. Mitchell stumbled behind her, struggling to keep up as they weaved through the trees. His breathing was labored, and Tara could tell he was starting to panic. But they couldn't afford to stop now. "We need to keep moving," Tara whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "If he finds us." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what would happen if Daniels caught up to them. They had seen firsthand what he was capable of, and neither of them wanted to experience it again. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Tara's stomach tightened with fear. Daniels was close, too close. They needed to find a way out, or at least a place to hide. "Over here," Mitchell whispered, his voice hoarse as he grabbed her arm and pointed to a thick cluster of bushes up ahead. Tara didn't hesitate. She ducked down behind the bushes, pulling Mitchell with her. The branches scratched at her skin, but she barely noticed. Her focus was entirely on the approaching footsteps, each one sending a wave of dread through her body. They crouched in silence, barely daring to breathe as the footsteps drew closer. Tara's heart pounded in her chest, and she prayed that the darkness would be enough to hide them. The sound of footsteps stopped suddenly, and Tara's breath caught in her throat. She could hear someone standing just a few feet away, the soft rustle of leaves under their boots the only sound in the still night. Her mind raced. What if Daniels found them? What if he knew exactly where they were hiding? She could feel Mitchell trembling beside her, and she silently prayed that he would stay quiet. For what felt like an eternity, they remained frozen in place, waiting. Then, without warning, the footsteps started again, this time moving away from them. Tara let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through her. "He's going the other way," Mitchell whispered, his voice barely audible. Tara nodded, though her body remained tense. Daniels might have moved on for now, but she knew he wouldn't give up that easily. They were far from safe. "We can't stay here," Tara whispered, her eyes scanning the darkness around them. "We need to keep moving." Mitchell hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Together, they carefully stood up and began making their way deeper into the woods, their footsteps barely making a sound on the soft forest floor. The night stretched on, and with every step they took, the weight of Daniel's pursuit hung over them like a storm cloud. Tara knew that they couldn't keep running forever, but for now, all they could do was stay one step ahead. Tara and Mitchell trudged deeper into the forest, their breath shallow and their bodies tense. The air around them was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Even though they had managed to evade Daniels for now, Tara couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The trees seemed to close in around them as they moved farther away from the road. The ground was uneven, littered with fallen branches and thick underbrush that made every step a challenge. Tara's legs ached, but she forced herself to keep going. She couldn't afford to stop now. They were still being hunted. Mitchell stumbled beside her, his face pale in the faint moonlight that managed to filter through the canopy of trees. His breathing was heavy, and Tara could tell he was struggling to keep up. She slowed her pace slightly, glancing over at him with concern. "You okay?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the still night. Mitchell nodded, though his expression was grim. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just trying to catch my breath." Tara knew he was exhausted, but they couldn't stop. Not yet. Not while Daniels was still out there, somewhere, searching for them. "We have to keep moving," she said softly, her eyes scanning the darkness around them. "We need to find a place to hide until we can come up with a plan." Mitchell didn't argue. He simply nodded and kept walking, though his steps were slower, more labored. Tara's mind raced as they pressed on, trying to figure out their next move. They couldn't stay in the forest forever, and they couldn't go back to the road. Daniels would be waiting for them, and she had no doubt he'd be even more determined to catch them now. Suddenly, Mitchell stopped in his tracks, his hand shooting out to grab Tara's arm. She turned to him, her heart leaping into her throat. "What is it?" she whispered urgently. Mitchell didn't answer right away. Instead, he pointed ahead, his eyes wide with alarm. Tara followed his gaze, squinting into the darkness. At first, she didn't see anything, but then, as her eyes adjusted to the faint moonlight, she noticed the outline of a building in the distance. It was an old cabin, its wooden frame barely visible through the thick trees that surrounded it. The windows were dark, and the roof sagged slightly, as if the structure had been abandoned for years. But it was shelter, temporary, at least, and right now, that was all they needed. "Come on," Tara said quietly, tugging Mitchell's arm. "Let's check it out." They moved cautiously toward the cabin, their footsteps nearly silent on the forest floor. As they approached, Tara couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled in her chest. The cabin looked deserted, but she knew better than to let her guard down. Daniels was still out there, and the last thing they needed was to walk into a trap. They reached the front of the cabin, and Tara carefully tried the door. It creaked loudly as it swung open, the sound echoing through the quiet night. She winced but quickly pushed the door open wider, gesturing for Mitchell to follow her inside. The interior of the cabin was just as dilapidated as the outside. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung from the corners of the ceiling. The furniture, what little there was old and worn, the wood splintered and cracked from years of neglect. A musty smell filled the air, and the floor creaked under their weight as they stepped inside. Tara closed the door behind them, her eyes scanning the room for anything they could use. There wasn't much, just a few broken chairs and a table that looked like it could collapse at any moment. But at least they had walls around them now, some semblance of protection. "We can stay here for a bit," Tara said, though she wasn't entirely convinced it was a good idea. "Just until we figure out what to do next." Mitchell nodded, sinking down onto one of the broken chairs with a sigh of relief. He wiped a hand across his forehead, his face slick with sweat despite the cool night air. "This place gives me the creeps," Mitchell muttered, glancing around the room. "But I guess it's better than being out there." Tara agreed, though she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The cabin felt too quiet, too still. Her instincts told her to be on alert, but she didn't want to panic Mitchell. They were already on edge, and the last thing they needed was for fear to take over. "We'll be fine," Tara said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "We just need to rest for a bit, then we'll figure out our next move." Mitchell nodded again, though he didn't look entirely convinced. Tara couldn't blame him. Everything about this situation was wrong, and it seemed like no matter what they did, they were always one step behind. Tara moved toward one of the windows, carefully pulling back the tattered curtain just enough to peer outside. The forest stretched out before them, dark and foreboding. She couldn't see any sign of Daniels, but that didn't mean he wasn't out there. "We'll have to leave soon," she said quietly, more to herself than to Mitchell. "We can't stay here for long." Mitchell looked up at her, his expression tired but determined. "What's the plan? We can't just keep running forever." Tara sighed, letting the curtain fall back into place. "I don't know yet. But we can't go back to the road. Daniels will be waiting for us." Mitchell frowned, his brow furrowing in thought. "What if we try to reach the nearest town? There's got to be one nearby." Tara shook her head. "It's too risky. If Daniels finds us before we get there, we're done for." Silence fell between them as they both contemplated their next move. Tara's mind raced, trying to come up with a solution, but nothing seemed right. Every option felt dangerous, and the thought of confronting Daniels again made her stomach turn. Suddenly, the sound of a twig snapping outside broke the silence, and Tara's heart leaped into her throat. She exchanged a panicked glance with Mitchell, her pulse quickening. "Did you hear that?" Mitchell whispered, his voice barely audible. Tara nodded, her body going rigid as she strained to listen. There was no mistaking it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed through the trees outside the cabin. Daniels was here. Tara's heart raced as she pressed her back against the wall of the cabin, straining to hear the footsteps outside. Each sound sent a jolt of fear through her, tightening her chest. She motioned for Mitchell to keep quiet, her finger to her lips. His eyes were wide with fear, but he nodded, understanding the urgency of the situation. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to hide. It was as if they knew exactly where Tara and Mitchell were, and they were taking their time getting to them. Tara's mind raced with thoughts of what Daniels would do if he found them. He had already made it clear that he wouldn't hesitate to use force, and there was no telling how far he'd go to protect himself now. Tara's hand instinctively went to her waistband, where her FBI-issued firearm was hidden. She had almost forgotten about it in the chaos of their escape. She didn't want to use it. Violence wasn't her first option, but if it came down to protecting herself or Mitchell, she wouldn't hesitate. The sound of the footsteps stopped just outside the cabin door. Tara held her breath, her body tense, waiting for the next move. A few agonizing moments passed in silence. Then, there was a loud bang as the door swung open, crashing against the wall with a force that made the entire cabin shake. Tara's heart skipped a beat as she and Mitchell flattened themselves against the wall, trying to stay out of sight. She could hear the sound of heavy boots stepping inside, slow and purposeful. Her pulse quickened, every instinct in her body telling her to run, but there was nowhere to go. They were trapped. Tara, Mitchell's voice was barely a whisper, his face pale with fear. What do we do? Tara shook her head, her hand tightening around the grip of her gun. Stay quiet, she mouthed. Don't move. The figure in the doorway stood for a moment, surveying the room. Tara could hear his shallow breathing, and her mind instantly recognized the pattern. It was Daniel's. She had heard his voice and seen his face enough times to know it was him. But why was he being so slow? Was he toying with them, enjoying their fear? Come out, wherever you are, Daniels taunted, his voice dripping with cruelty. You can't hide forever, Agent Lawson. Tara felt a chill run down her spine at the sound of his voice. He knew she was there. There was no point in hiding any longer. Slowly, Tara edged toward the corner, her back still pressed against the wall, her gun now drawn but hidden behind her. She needed to stay calm, stay smart. Mitchell's breathing grew heavier, and Tara could sense his panic rising. She glanced at him, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. They had to stay strong. They couldn't let fear control them. Daniels took another step into the cabin, his flashlight beam scanning the room. You thought you could run from me, he said, a sneer evident in his tone. You thought you could get away after what you did? Tara's mind raced. What was he talking about? What had she done? She had only been doing her job, investigating the case, and yet here she was, being hunted like a criminal. I know you're in here, Tara, Daniels continued, his voice growing louder. I can smell your fear. Why don't you make this easy on yourself and come out? You know this isn't going to end well for you. Tara's grip on her gun tightened. She could feel the weight of it in her hand, and it gave her a small sense of control in a situation that felt completely out of her hands. But she had to be careful. One wrong move, and things could escalate in a way she couldn't come back from. She peeked around the corner, just enough to catch a glimpse of Daniels. He was standing in the middle of the room now, his flashlight illuminating the dust-filled air around him. His expression was cold, emotionless, as if he was simply going through the motions of a routine traffic stop rather than hunting down a fellow law enforcement officer. Tara's mind raced with options. She could confront him now, use her FBI credentials to try and de-escalate the situation. But would that work? Daniels didn't seem to care about her authority. In fact, he seemed to relish in the fact that he had her in this vulnerable position. He had already shown he had no respect for her as an agent, or as a human being. Suddenly, Mitchell shifted beside her, his foot accidentally brushing against a loose floorboard. The sound was faint, but in the silence of the cabin, it was enough to draw Daniel's attention. What was that? Daniel snapped, his head whipping around toward the source of the noise. Tara's heart dropped as she realized they had been discovered. There was no more time to hide, no more time to plan. She had to act now, or things would only get worse. Taking a deep breath, Tara stepped out from behind the wall, her gun still hidden at her side. Daniels, she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. It's over. You need to stop this. Daniel's eyes widened in surprise for a brief moment before his expression darkened. "Tara Lawson," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I knew you'd show yourself eventually." Tara held up her free hand, trying to keep things calm. "This doesn't have to go any further. Let's just talk." "Talk?" Daniel scoffed, taking a step toward her. "You think I'm interested in talking? After everything you've done?" Tara frowned, confused. "What are you talking about, Daniels? What did I do?" Daniel sneered, his grip tightening on the baton he held in his hand. "You think you can just come into my town and start digging into things that don't concern you? You think you can just poke around in my business and walk away?" Tara's eyes narrowed. So that was it. This wasn't just about a routine stop. Daniels had something to hide, and her investigation had come too close to uncovering it. "I was just doing my job," Tara said, her voice firm. "You can't keep running from this. Sooner or later, the truth will come out." Daniel's face twisted with rage, and for a moment, Tara thought he might actually attack her. But instead, he took a deep breath, his expression turning cold once again. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Agent Lawson," he said quietly. "But you will. Soon enough." Before Tara could respond, Daniels lunged at her, his baton raised high. Tara reacted on instinct, ducking out of the way just in time to avoid the blow. She spun around, her gun now fully drawn, but before she could fire, Daniels grabbed her wrist, twisting it painfully until the gun fell from her hand and clattered to the floor. Mitchell shouted in alarm, rushing toward Daniels to help, but Daniels was too fast. With a swift motion, he shoved Tara to the ground, turning to face Mitchell with a deadly look in his eyes. Tara lay on the floor, stunned and weak after Daniels had pushed her down. The cabin's dim light flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls as she tried to regain her composure. Mitchell stood nearby, his hands raised in a futile attempt to protect himself as Daniels loomed over him. Tara's mind raced, searching for a solution to the terrifying situation. Daniels had stripped her of her gun, but she still had her training and quick thinking. She needed to use both to get out of this alive. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. She could not afford to let fear paralyze her. With a sudden burst of energy, Tara rolled away from Daniels, trying to put some distance between them. Her heart pounded in her chest as she scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting around the room for any potential weapons or tools she could use. Daniels, momentarily surprised by Tara's resilience, growled in frustration. "You're a tough one, aren't you? But this ends now." Tara could see Mitchell's eyes darting nervously between her and Daniels. He was clearly scared, but he was also trying to figure out how to help. Tara had to act quickly. She couldn't afford to wait for Daniels to make the next move. As Daniels advanced toward her, Tara's eyes landed on a heavy metal pipe lying in a corner of the cabin. It wasn't ideal, but it was something. She dashed toward it, grabbing it just as Daniels lunged at her again. With a swift swing, Tara knocked Daniels back, giving herself a few precious seconds to think. Daniels stumbled but quickly recovered, his rage apparent. "You think a pipe is going to stop me? You've got another thing coming." Despite his bravado, Tara noticed a hint of hesitation in Daniel's movements. Maybe he was starting to realize that she wasn't going to be as easy to handle as he thought. Tara took advantage of this brief moment, her mind racing with strategies. "Mitchell, stay back," Tara shouted, her voice filled with urgency. "I need you to stay out of this. Find help." Mitchell hesitated for a second, clearly torn between staying and running. But seeing the determination in Tara's eyes, he nodded and bolted for the door, disappearing into the night. Tara's focus returned to Daniels. He was recovering from the blow she had delivered, but his anger seemed to grow with each passing second. Tara needed to use his anger against him. If she could make him underestimate her, she might find an opening to gain the upper hand. As Daniels approached again, Tara's movements were deliberate and controlled. She swung the pipe defensively, keeping Daniels at bay. Her training had taught her how to handle confrontations like this, but dealing with someone so unhinged was a different challenge. "Why are you doing this, Daniels?" Tara demanded, her voice firm despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "What's your endgame?" Daniels snarled, his face twisted with hatred. "You think you're so high and mighty, don't you? You FBI agents, you think you can come into my town and dig into things that don't concern you? You think you're above everyone else?" Tara could see the venom in his eyes, and it was clear that this was more than just a personal vendetta. Daniels had something to hide, and her investigation had touched a nerve. But it was too late for explanations. Tara needed to stay focused on the immediate danger. Daniels lunged again, but this time, Tara was ready. She sidestepped his attack and swung the pipe once more, this time making contact with his arm. Daniels roared in pain, clutching his arm as he staggered back. Tara seized the opportunity, moving quickly to disarm him. With a well-aimed strike, she knocked the baton from Daniels' hand, sending it skidding across the floor. Tara moved to grab it, but Daniels was not finished yet. He lunged at her, his desperation clear. Just as Daniels reached her, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Tara's heart leaped with hope. Help was on the way. The sound grew louder, and Daniels' expression shifted from anger to panic. He realized his time was running out. "You're finished, Daniels," Tara said, her voice resolute. "The police are coming." Daniels hesitated, his eyes darting toward the door. For a moment, it looked like he might try to flee. But then he turned back to Tara, his face a mask of fury. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice low and threatening. "You haven't heard the last of me." Before Tara could respond, Daniels turned and fled out the back door of the cabin, disappearing into the darkness. Tara wasted no time grabbing the baton and checking to make sure Mitchell was safe. The sound of sirens grew closer, and Tara could see flashing lights through the windows. She sighed with relief as the first police cars arrived, their lights cutting through the cabin's darkness. Officers rushed in, their faces a mixture of concern and determination. Agent Lawson, one of the officers, called out, his voice filled with recognition. "Are you okay?" Tara nodded, her body trembling with exhaustion. "I'm fine. But we need to find Daniels. He's dangerous and armed." The officers quickly took charge, spreading out to search for Daniels. Tara watched as they moved with precision and urgency. She knew that Daniels wouldn't get far. The police were determined and well-equipped, and with Tara's description, they had a good chance of catching him. As the officers worked, Tara's thoughts turned to Mitchell. He was safe, but the trauma of the night would linger. Tara knew that this was